Hi, thank you very much for having me. Thank you very much for the invitation from Severi. It's my first time to Brazil, actually my first time to the Americas. I pretty much travel Africa, Europe and Asia. And being based in Johannesburg, and with Victor mentioning the high-speed trains in China, we have, with the World Cup, also received some public infrastructure, namely the Gautrain, which has now reduced my traveling time to the airport from about an hour to 12 minutes. We definitely need more infrastructure rollouts of such kinds, not only in South Africa, but the rest of the continent. Just quickly to clarify perhaps some confusion, you will see, can we have the presentation? Thank you. I wear two hats, perhaps because I have a split personality. The one is at Frontier Advisory, which is a private company established and headquartered in Johannesburg. We advise particularly South African companies, JSE-listed firms and companies with global ambitions, with Africa ambitions, with Asia ambitions on their engagement strategies into largely the continent. And when they look into the continent, one of the key concerns that they are faced with, obviously, is China, either as a competitor or potentially also as a collaborator. My second hat is at the Golden Institute of Business Science, the China-Africa Network. The center was established in January this year. It's headed by Dr. Martin Davies, who's also the CEO of Frontier Advisory, and who has more than 20 years' experience in the Sino-African field. Being a relatively new center, we're currently establishing a number of engagements, and we work with a number of donors, including the Rockefeller Foundation, the Department for International Development, JICA, the Japanese Development Agency, WWF, UNDP, amongst others. Just a brief introduction and some discussion points that I will be looking at, and I think my presentation is way longer than the time that I have, so some slides I'm just going to skip through, but I think the presentation will be made available afterwards. I'll be focusing a brief introduction, looking at trade relations, and I hope to be adding some meat to what already was mentioned earlier. Unfortunately, I did not get all of what was said in session one due to some translation problems, but I do hope that I'm not repeating anything. I'll be looking at China's investment and financing activities, very briefly touch on development assistance, very, very briefly on debt sustainability, and discuss some future sectors of investments and prospects between China and Africa. For those of you that follow The Economist, it's always nice to follow the front covers of The Economist, very telling stories. March 2008, that was the front cover picture. And I think particularly in the West, China in Africa is a very much sensationalized topic. I hope South Africa is maybe one case, but I hope that you share my views that in Africa we actually see China and Brazil as a partner in development. Just to show you a brief slide to add to my introduction. Here we go. We mapped the real GDP growth of China and Africa, and you can see a new growth coupling. There was a lot of talk in The Economist about decoupling of the economy, the global economy, particularly Asia, from the West. Then there was decoupling 2.0, I think it was. Well, I think this is what we refer to as the new growth coupling. The increasing relationship between China and Africa. Victor was talking about China as a market for African products. I think this pretty much resembles China as a market for African resource products, but also China's needs for resources to fuel its ability to grow in the future. Looking at trade relations, this was discussed briefly already. Ahead of time, the $100 billion trade mark between China and Africa was reached, as Victor already mentioned. However, the repercussions of the financial crisis in the trade data was quite visible. Chinese imports from Africa were down by almost 25%, largely due to lower resource prices, lower oil prices, whereas Chinese exports to Africa were also down by about 6%. What's interesting when you look at the data is that Africa was actually running faster than it was in 2008, thus mitigating some of those drops in prices, particularly oil, by exporting a bit more. Yet Africa's key exports to China continue to be oil. About 2/3 of the export profile is oil. And I think I need to add that that's not very different to its export profile to some of the other major economies, for example, the US, and I'll show that just now. In terms of the trading profile beyond oil, it's diamonds, wood, iron ore, and raw materials as such constitute about 70 to 80% of Africa's exports. Very, very concentrated on the import side, much more diversified, importing manufactured goods, capital goods, in line with obviously the inroads of Chinese construction companies also into the continent. In terms of the trade partners, also highly concentrated. You'll see that China's top trading partner, and it's been straddling this, it's between Angola and South Africa from year to year. In 2008, Angola, South Africa, Sudan, and Nigeria, in that order, together made up 55% of total trade. On the export side, very much resource-orientated. Key exporters, Angola, South Africa, dominated by iron ore exports, Sudan, obviously oil, and the Congo. On the import side, it's South Africa that was a key importer, Nigeria, very much construction material focused, Egypt, and Angola. And just to show you that Africa's trade with China is actually not that different on the export side than its exports to the US. I hope the figures are visible, and you will see in the first column, it's Africa's exports to China versus second column, Africa's exports to the US. First in total values in 2008, exports to the US were almost double to that to China. And you will see that mineral fuels, precious metals, and base metals dominate most of the trade in 2008 on the export side. And on the import side, also a similar profile between China to Africa, as well as China's exports, i.e. the world's imports from China. I think this is quite a nice cartoon to illustrate sometimes the sentiment and the feelings that we have in Africa. There you see the tsunami of Chinese goods and Indian goods. Obviously, there's many debates that we can have about this cartoon, but I think one of the key things that comes out of this is to what extent are Chinese goods and products that are flooding African markets, taking away opportunities from locals, postponing perhaps the industrialization and the diversification process on the continent. Obviously, the other side of the coin is greater consumer choice, products that are actually new rather than second-hand products that came to Africa. Some interesting points to debate. Just in terms of China's top trading partners, if you group Africa as a continent, which I hate doing, but we do it all the time, in 2009 it actually ranked between the 6th and 7th largest trading partners, Germany and Australia, of China. But individually, these countries are not very big trading partners of China.